originally posted on the official Frictional Games blog. Alien Isolation is an interesting game. It is the latest entry in our lineage of games that I refer to as horror simulators. It does an excellent job at creating tension, and uses a lot of the knowledge built up over the years to great success. But because it has such a laser focus on a certain type of play, a bunch of problems arise and other parts of the package suffer. It is a great game in many ways. Truly excellent really. But there are some fundamental problems. This led to, for me at least, a devastating flaw. At its core, it fails to be a faithful emulation of the original Alien 1979 movie. Before we can properly discuss the game, we need to talk some video game history and design theory. Over the past, there has been two different schools of horror games. One that has a horror wrapping on top of standardized gameplay, horror wrapping, and one that tries to recreate the happenings of a scary movie novel, horror simulation. The former is quite well known and started with games like Lurking Horror 1987. Mechanically, the game played like other contemporary adventure games, but took place in a scary setting with events meant to frighten the player. The latter one is a bit harder to nail down precisely, but I would say it started out with the 3D Monster Maze 1982, a game that is neatly captured in its name. The player is trapped in a maze and needs to escape a monster, in this case, a heavily pixelated T-Rex. While the horror wrapping design has thrived over the years, being a design cornerstone for games like Phantasmagoria 1995, an adventure game.
7. THQEST 1993
A puzzler, and Resident Evil 1996, an action shooter. The horror simulation is much rarer. After 3D Monster Maze, the next game to do it somewhat properly was Clock Tower 1995. It is now time to dig into the distinction between these two types of design. What sets Clock Tower apart from Resident Evil is that its core mechanic is not there to entertain. It is there to put the player in the shoes of a protagonist in a horror story. Clock Tower does this by having a single monster, a little guy with giant scissors, hunting the player in certain scenes. The player can choose to hide in closets, under beds, and hope that the monster does not find and kill them. Compare this to the core mechanic of Resident Evil, where the player needs to scavenge for ammo, weapons and health potions, and then combat the monsters encountered. Resident Evil's gameplay could really work with any sort of theme and setting, while the one in Clock Tower is much more focused on being a horror experience. It is important to mention that a Resident Evil does tons of things to crank up the level of scariness. Scarce ammunition, inventory management, limited saves, etc. But none of this give rise to any specific horror scenarios. The game is still all about shooting various enemies in order to progress. There are very few sections in Resident Evil would fit a horror movie, a novel. But Clock Tower is filled with these moments. The core difference can be summed up as Clock Tower being focused on having plenty of words that are related to a horror movie: hide under bed, looking into a mirror, run away, push monster, etc. As the player plays the game, the reenact scenes of horror simply by following the rules set out by the gameplay. Resident Evil hardly does it all, the focus being much more on standard tactical combat, with certain scariness attached to it. As a horror simulator, and really horror game in general, Clock Tower is not very successful though. First, much of the gameplay is actually pretty standard adventure game affair. Second, The actual chase moments are quite clumsy and frustrating to play, rarely resulting in any proper feelings of dread and terror. Despite this, quite major shortcomings as a horror simulator, Clock Tower is well worth studying. If you look past its flaws, there exists a focus on making horror elements playable that just did not exist in games at the time. In fact, it is really hard to find similar games until quite recently. Hell Knight, Orca Dark Messiah, 1998, has the player running from a single monster, and features cool stuff, like a look behind you button, and having to carefully choose a companion. But it also suffers from lots of problems, and is often a very frustrating experience. Even such horror classics such as Silent Hill, 1999, have little focus on trying to do proper horror simulation. Most of the game is based around solving puzzles and fighting enemies. While running is sometimes advisable, most encounters are best handled through combat. Instead, a lot of your typical horror moments are not simulated, but put outside of the player's control. For instance, in Silent Hill 2, 2001, when the protagonist hides in a closet, it happens in a cutscene. Remember, this is a scene that played out through gameplay in Clock Tower. If you look at the large body of the gameplay the player does in a Silent Hill game, little of it resembles what you would see in a novel or film. In fact, it resembles little of how a rational person would behave in similar scenarios. This does not make the games bad by any means, but it is a crucial concept to keep in mind. The games heavily rely on standard, often narrative-wise nonsensical gameplay in order to create the foundational engagement for the player. The next game, after Clock Tower, to really give horror simulation another proper goal was Siren, 2003. Here the player's actions are a lot more aligned with how it makes sense for them to act. For instance, it features a map without any indicator of the player position, and also allows you to see the world through the monster's eyes. In all, it creates a much stronger sense of being inside a horror story. The problem with Siren, like Clock Tower, is that this focus amounted to a very frustrating experience, which in turn diminishes the overall immersion and scariness. Once again, this type of design did not gain any traction. I now need to briefly discuss a design concept called mental modeling, a concept that is closely related to the difference between horror wrapping and horror simulation. When you play a game like Resident Evil, every encounter is a very tactical and precise decision. You look at what kind of opponent you are facing, what weapons you have, the current ammo supply, health levels, etc. The model in your head is much less about the appearance of the creatures, and much more about pure numbers. This can be very stressful, and combined with the horror thematic, the total experience can feel quite scary. But on the whole, very little is left to the imagination and narrative-related intuition. In a game like Siren, however, you are much more worried about what you cannot see, and your mind is racing with trying to predict future happenings. Combine this with a map that forces you to think yourself as part of the environment, and monsters that you mostly keep track of by inferring their position, and you get a mental model that is far more horror-like and vivid. The problem is that since you lack the sense of numerical certainty that Resident Evil supplies, it becomes much harder to formulate correct tactical decisions. This is a fact that I think has a part in making this kind of games so frustrating. It is clear that the mental modeling that Siren has is better suited for a horror game, but it was not yet working properly gameplay-wise. Now, back to game history again. The release of Siren marks the beginning of the end of what I would like to call the golden age of survival horror. It had brought us gems like Resident Evil, Silent Hill, Fatal Frame, 2001, all of which brought a very fresh take on the horror experience. But after that, the well seemed to dry up and horror games got increasingly action-oriented. Resident Evil 4, 2005, really got this trend going. One reason for this change in focus is partly diminishing sales and increasing production costs. Another major unconnected reason was almost certainly the lack of evolution in the genre. All of the big games had been based on horror wrapping, with most of the gameplay being quite standard. The wrapping did not allow for much change, and when the focus was put on the underlying mechanics, the horror rapidly faded. It took a while before anything new came along, and this is where we enter the picture. When we released Penumbra: Black Plague, 2008, we made our attempt at doing a game without having any weapons. It had a bunch of issues, but showed promise in how it changed the player's perception of the game's world. The decision was based on lessons learned for Penumbra: Overture, 2007, and from the lineage of games discussed above. The following year sees the release of another combat-free horror, Silent Hill: Shattered Memories, 2009, which also puts emphasis on crafting more of a horror simulation.